A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Jessica Lancome-Frost, and I'm a Policy Officer at NAUC. It is my pleasure to be chairing today's event on planning for the future, navigating the new planning framework. Firstly, I'd like to quickly run through a few housekeeping announcements, some of which are shown on screen. Do use the Q&A function throughout the event to put questions to our speakers, and the chat function to interact with your fellow delegates and to share any information or links. If you require any technical support, please do post in the chat, and my NAUC colleagues will try their best to help. Closed caption feature can be accessed by all attendees at any time during today's event. Once the captions are on, you can access a live transcription of the event. After the event, we will send the presentation slides used today, the chat, and any other useful information. And we will also be inviting your feedback on today's event. So please do look out for the feedback form, which should pop up on your screens following the conclusion of the webinar. Now, I'd like to thank its partners, Clear Council's Insurance, CCLA, and Bless Your Illumination for the extensive support for today's NAUC online event. Now, the government has prioritised updating the National Planning Policy Framework to boost house building, growth and sustainability. Where do local councils fit into this evolving landscape? And can governments achieve their housing targets while integrating community feedback through a democratic planning process? Explore the new planning landscape and gain exclusive insights into how the updated framework affects local councils and the future of housing development. Attendees will leave understanding the complexities of balancing large-scale growth with genuine community engagement, and learn from success stories on how local councils have effectively amplified their voices and influenced planning decisions in their communities. So, I'm thrilled to be joined today by a brilliant panel of speakers. Hugh Ellis, Director of Policy at the Town and Country Planning Association, Roger Mortlock, Chief Executive, and Paul Miner, Head of Policy and Planning, both at the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and Andrew Tallerton, National Planning Advisor at the Society of Local Council Clerks. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Hugh. Over to you, Hugh.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for asking me to talk. I'm going to be quite quick, if that's okay, and just to talk a little bit to set the scene, because you've got some very excellent presentations coming up that I know are going to also talk about some of the detail. So I want to talk to you all really of just about three challenges that I think come out of planning reform in this order. If you come from the TCPA, and there's some great resources on our website in terms of follow-up if you want to go and look at them, you believe intrinsically that people are a solution to the problems that they face in their communities, not a problem. The problem we've got with planning reform is that you have a Whitehall and Westminster that largely assumes communities are in the way of development. And that setting that tension up is really negative, I think, and has led to some of the mistakes that government has made with planning reform. Mistakes, I think, that you in town and parish councils are going to have to try to mediate and deal with and work through. But at heart, the power of parish and town councils to shape their own future, to work out the solutions that actually will deal with things like the climate crisis, with flooding, with community-led energy and housing, you are the answer to many of the questions that government is struggling with. And it's vital, before I get too depressing about planning reform, to make sure that your voice is really powerfully heard in that process. I think it would be a terrible mistake today to say that having that voice is easy. I've spent some time with parish councils in Suffolk, who, as you all know, have got the greatest concentration of major infrastructure projects I think we've ever seen, and helping them navigate through the process of dealing with major infrastructure just made me understand how much pressure there is on parish and town councils actually to participate, and given they're all volunteers and given the limited resources. And somebody asked me a really good question. They said, is there any point in participating in this new system? And I kind of went, hell yes, because the alternative is to surrender. So it's vital that you have a voice in this process, even though at times that can be difficult. So the second big theme is what is planning reform, and I won't dwell too much on that. As I said, you have some other excellent presentations, I think, coming forward around it. But from us at TCPA, you are facing a system now which is mind-bogglingly complicated and incredibly ineffective. And you have to kind of be an evil genius to create a system like that, right? It is extraordinary outcome, really, in terms of planning reform. So it's amendment on amendment and lots of new planning law coming in. But the bones of that have a number of themes, which I'm sure will get picked out in greater detail around that. There's a big move to strategic planning. There's a big move to simplification and streamlining and deregulation, particularly around flood risk, which we're very worried about in terms of surface water. And there is a big theme here about removing democratic oversight. I know we're all meant to be very polite about it, but the national scheme of delegation that's in the planning and infrastructure bill that's currently in the House of Lords would effectively give the Secretary of State power to force councils to delegate any planning decision to officers. Now, speaking as a professional planner, you might think I'd be pleased about that, but planning is a democratic enterprise, right? Whether we like it or not, democracy should be core to the decisions that are made, and local communities actually do know best very often about how to meet their needs. And my experience of that is that they do want to meet their housing needs in reasonable ways. So you've got these tendencies in planning reform, which are actually about driving democracy out the local plan process. And you've also got a big move to strategic scale planning, and of course at the same time a devolution bill. The devolution bill, of course, is interesting because you can't think about planning reform without it and the new sort of structures it's creating. But I don't know if anyone's on the call from Derbyshire, because that's where I'm from. And in Derbyshire, I'm really worried that we end up with a big new strategic authority that's even more remote from people and decision making. And the problem with that is it puts more pressure, does it not, on parish and town councils, because you're the only form of kind of democratic accountability that people will be able to see. And I think there should be a strong debate going on in that bill about giving parish, town, and town councils more planning powers and a stronger voice in decision making going forward. So the elements of the bill that I think are challenging are around that de-democratisation. And to be perfectly frank, we're a pro-housing organisation. We built Letchworth Garden City. We're acutely focused on housing need, as many of the other organisations are on this call. But the system is surrendering to an agenda set by volume house builders. And they're not going to build the number of houses this nation needs, I can tell you that. But they're also not building at the right price in the right place to the right levels of resilience. So particularly, for example, on things like net zero, and there's a constant sense of trying to undermine important standards. So against that kind of narrative, the question is, well, in all this confusion, and if you do, like me, suffer from migraines, whenever I try to understand the English planning system, I get a migraine. But in all of that, what can we do is the question of this that others will answer, no doubt, better than I. Well, the chances are that you might be thinking about a neighbourhood plan. You might have been put off from doing a neighbourhood plan, and you know the government's basically defunded neighbourhood planning. But neighbourhood planning remains, for me, a central tool and a vital tool in the new system. It's largely untouched by planning reform. It remains a central element of what the local plan would be. And I would commend to you getting stuck into that, having a strong voice in it, difficult though it is, and sometimes financially difficult though it can be. It's certainly a tool that's worth exploring. And I think given the competence of a lot of town and parish councils, you can get a long way actually without spending too much money on your own, with your own priorities. And in those plans, things like how you deal with flood risk, how you deal with the climate challenge, how you deal with community-led housing are all opportunities I think you can seize. And I would strongly urge you to take those opportunities. And in the wider context of that, I think you also play a role in trying to help communities understand and galvanizing people's responses to the planning process. For me, the saddest thing to see is how people are locked out of the complexity of planning. They rely on their town and parish councils to help them navigate the process. And you, I know, have your own resource challenges, but you do play a vital role, I think, in that almost an educative role, really, in seeing how we can see our way through that. And then setting that vision for town and parish councils is so important. I think that planning is not just about the delivery of badly designed housing. It breaks my heart to see badly designed bolt-on estates going up in communities that don't meet local needs, that lock people into car dependency, that don't deal with the climate challenge. My God, we should be capable of doing so much better in this country. And actually, if parish councils have got a strong voice in that process, and town councils, then we are going to get better design outcomes. But that's only going to happen if you have a defined and powerful vision for your place, expressed in a neighbourhood plan or perhaps through other means, and you can galvanise a kind of argument around that. And then finally, just to close, because I know I need to be quick, just with this thought, when that person in Suffolk from a town council said to me, is there any point? I felt really galvanized for the first time. You're up against a big battle here for the future of what it is, what community development is in this nation. Current government doesn't really have a vision for that, which I think is really sad. You either turn your back on it and your communities become victims of development decisions, or you get stuck into it, acknowledging that you might lose occasionally. I think the spirit has to be get stuck in, make sure your voice is heard, make sure that voice is heard powerfully, take the best advice you can, and make sure that vision is at the heart of the future of your places, because Whitehall certainly doesn't know best. You on the whole do. That's my heresy for today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hugh. Now I'd like to hand it over to Roger and Paul. Over to you.
You might demuted. Can you hear me, Jessica?
Not very clearly. Can
Not
you
very clearly.
unmute on your computer?
Are you unmuted?
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Are you unmuted? Am I a bit clearer now?
A little bit, but it's still saying you're on mute.
Is that better?
Yeah. Now I
Great.
think there's a bit of an echo.
No, I think we've sorted that. We're
Okay.
doubling up in the same room. So I'm doing a double act with Paul. Welcome, everybody. And thank you, Hugh, for a cracking intro. I'm going to try not to, Hugh stole some of my favourite lines, so I'll try not to repeat them and build on them. But just to reiterate one point, was I think my proudest planning moments have been as a parish councillor. So I think, certainly on that kind of, I think the work I did in my 10 years of parish councillor is some of the proudest changes I was able to make on my doorstep, because they felt real and tangible, and they came from the hearts of people who live in that place. So more of that. I wanted to quickly whip through a couple of some slides just before Paul delves a bit deeper into some of the issues for parish councils. So at the beginning of it, they say a week's a long time in politics. A year is certainly a very long time in planning politics at the moment. Just before the publication of the latest NPPF, we put these couple of slides out to see where we were coming from, what we wanted to see. And I think we've probably not seen much of this at all. So I put these up just to say where our hope was about what the system would be delivering. So this first one about genuinely affordable homes, especially in rural areas, and add some real teeth to a brownfield first approach. We've seen some moves in the right direction. Next one, please. Perhaps one of the big sacrifices would be on the green belt, so an early sacrificial lamb in the planning process, and more of that in a sec. But also, we're not going to be covering this, but quite a lot of work for us around renewables and the transition to net zero and what it means for our landscapes, as well as, of course, and I think this has come through a lot in the planning and infrastructure bill, how do we support nature's recovery and think more strategically about land use. So next one, please. So just thinking about like the context we're in, I think this is useful because planning reform happens in there's always other stuff around that drives it, and you might well believe that the only purpose of planning listening over the last year is to power growth, and more about the purpose of planning in a second. But certainly the sort of drivers definitely feel about we're working in a system that's changing at speed, and there isn't the money in the system there has been in other times. I think some of the things for us that feel completely at risk, just as a result of to build on what Hugh said, is that quality feels like it's under threat and democracy feels like it's under threat in some of the suggestions. And some of the sort of dynamics that are around that is that I think we've seen increasingly polarization. I think we see increasing polarization between urban and rural communities, the whole building and building versus blockers language, the NIMBY versus YIMBYs languages, polarization of people to be on the side of planning or building or not, we think is unhelpful when people care hugely passionately about what's happening. And sort of added to that, I would say a tunnel vision about land use. So, we're still thinking about, as Hugh said, thinking about planning in one box, thinking about where we put houses in one box, where we put infrastructure for energy in another box, thinking about roads in another box. And I think some of that kind of tunnel vision is really not helping us to get the best use of land. So if we go to the next one, please. And I think one of the amendments put down and dismissed in the planning and infrastructure bill was from the brilliant Ellie Chowns, who's the Green MP for North Herefordshire, who suggested some clarity around the purpose of planning. And as I said, it's not about growth. It's always been this about how do we develop land for the long-term public interest. And Ellie suggested some other things which I've been holding dear as we've been going through this process. So that needed to include the health and well-being of future generations. It's firming up our obligations under the Environment Act and the Climate Change Act, firming up our commitments to the UN sustainability goals, and finally, and I think really importantly in this case, thinking about a fair process that included and valued the feedback of individuals and communities. So next one, please. I think that's led to for CPRE is these sets of issues that I think continue to be worrying for us. So one is, and we just published a report a few weeks ago that just showed that, the brownfield register continues to rise, and we see increasingly big developers reaching for the playbook of their delivery mechanism, which is, those greenfield sites on the edge of towns, creating car-dependent, unsustainable communities. We've seen this worrying persistence of the market model that we have in this country. So, and a small number of big developers powering the model. And it's just worth remembering that this is an unusual model and that other countries don't quite have that same model. And that if you look to continental Europe, the vast majority of housing is delivered in a kind of custom self-build model. I think we're still not seeing enough kind of detail around how the affordable housing push is going to impact on local government on rural affordable housing. I think there's a huge sequencing issue that Hugh pointed out around local government reform. You should be starting with that process, like having that intersecting it right at this point is causing more pain and confusion in the process, but it does give us that hope around strategic planning. And I think this flawed formula that we're almost a year into with the calculation of the standard method. So how do we come up with a number of houses that we need to build in each area? We know that it's been unfairly impacting on rural areas and leading to a swelling of targets unnecessarily, completely unrelated to need and demand. Next one, please. I was just going to mention, we've gone the other way. Just quickly, this one. I think one of the things we've heard quite a lot is a rhetoric around these figures. We're thinking about this failing of us governments relating to being able to deliver the figures. It's not just a UK problem, it's an everywhere problem. And the other thing was just looking at the economics of investment in affordable housing. This very good graph at the bottom just showing as we've reduced the investment in council and social homes, we've also massively increased the public purse spend on benefits. So I think it's worth holding on to that when we think about the economics of this long term. Next one, please. I just did want to mention, if we go one more, that's it. Just on CPR, I think that there's been a real casualty around the Greenbelt. I know it won't affect everybody on the call, but for those of you who it does, I think we're seeing in some areas of the country nearly every application in the Greenbelt being classed as grey belt. But I don't think the grey belt problem is the only challenge. I think we've seen an undermining of a designation that protects huge amounts of this country and gives people that access to the countryside that is so critical, we know from COVID. I think if we go to the next one, I think one of the ways that CPRE operates is through the Better Planning Coalition. So we're really proud to be bringing these people together, including now, I'm pleased to say, including TCPA. I think lots of the work behind the scenes around the Planning and Infrastructure Bill has been done with these people coming together. I think there's important nationally that we kind of work together as well as working separately on the issues we care about. And finally, from me, before I pass to Paul, next slide, please. Just this quote from Nye Bevan. So one of the things I think it was my favorite quote to kind of use with a lot of kind of government officials is actually what really matters is quality, not the number. And actually, if we want to secure the outcomes we have for the future, what matters is getting it right, not being slaves to an artificial target. Thank you. I'll pass on to Paul.
So switch the mics.
Switch the mics. Here we go.
Thanks very much, Roger. Can everyone hear me okay? Just checking all the sound's working okay. So if we move on to our next slide, please. Yeah, that's just the title slide. Next slide after that. Yeah, thank you. So just picking up on what Roger was saying about the planning and infrastructure bill, and also Hugh's points about planning committee changes. So some of what's being proposed in the bill about reformed planning committees we would welcome. So in particular, mandatory training of committee members, and also from our point of view, it does make sense to set a maximum size for overall planning committees. We also get the sense as well that the government's approach towards a national scheme of delegation planning committees is, as things stand, the right one, and that they're looking, the model that they're proposing is effectively a triage model between the head of planning in a local authority and the chair of the planning committee. We've seen that in local authorities such as Shropshire, for example, that scheme of delegation has actually worked quite effectively, and that it's actually allowed councils to issue timely planning decisions, but also planning decisions that command public confidence. There are other elements of the bill that we support, in particular spatial development strategies. We think there's a bit, like the TCPA, we think there's a big gap in terms of strategic planning, larger than local, which hasn't been adequately filled since the last government abolished regional spatial strategies in 2010, 2011. So we're supportive of spatial development strategies in principle. We do have concerns, like other members of the Better Planning Coalition, around the proposed Nature Restoration Fund. There aren't sufficient guarantees that it won't be a license to trash, or it won't follow the well-established precautionary principle. There aren't sufficient guarantees as it stands that money raised from the Nature Restoration Fund will be spent on nature restoration. But again, in principle, we think that a more strategic approach to getting better nature conservation supported by new development is a good idea. Next slide, please. So we're expecting the revision to the National Planning Policy Framework to be consulted on as soon as the Planning and Infrastructure Bill gets royal assent. And the changes that we're expecting, that there'll be some that will flow from the changes that are brought in through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, such as on spatial development strategies and Nature Restoration Fund, for example. There'll also be some other changes that relate to the recommendations of the New Towns Task Force, which came out in September, and we'll say a bit more about New Towns later. But also we're expecting what's known as National Development Management Policies, or NDMPs. And it's not clear yet what form these will take or what they will cover, but we expect, from what we've heard, that they will replace those elements of the NPPF that relate to decision making. So areas that guide local authorities on how they take decisions on planning applications. And NDMPs could be quite wide-ranging. They could cover issues such as the heritage elements, the historic environment parts of the NPPF, also elements relating to greenbelt policy, for example. So if they are brought in the way that the legislation allows, they could override local plans. So it will be important for us to engage with this consultation and make sure that important protections aren't lost. Next slide, please. So, we've, as many of you will know, we've worked with NALC before on producing planning guidance for parish councils and CPRE members, and as part of the work we've done previously with NALC, we've done a suite of free planning guides which cover local plans, neighbourhood planning, and also planning applications. We updated the planning applications guide in April, and the new guide is available both on our website and also on NALC's website, and it simplifies, and the guidance can be simplified into 8 steps, which are on the slide given, but you'll be able to find the guide on our website. We're also updating the guide to local plans at the moment, so we're doing a short light touch update, which we hope to publish soon, and we will also do a more thorough going revision of the local plan guide next year when the changes to the local plan system are brought in that comes from that comes from the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. So as many of you will know, there's going to be a much faster local plan process brought in, which aims to get local plans consulted on, examined and adopted within 13 months. This new system will start to bite towards the end of next year, and we will update our guidance to reflect that. Next slide, please. So just following on from the points that Hugh made about neighbourhood plans, that we're strong supporters of neighbourhood planning, and that there have been many really good examples of where neighbourhood plans have brought forward local green space designations, for example. So there are over 8,000 local green space designations across England. The vast majority, well over 70% of these, are in neighbourhood plans. So that they've played a really valuable role in helping communities be able to best protect what's special to them in their area. Like you said, we're concerned about how neighbourhood plans will be brought forward and updated in future because of the ending of government support. However, there are some other elements that may give more cause for hope and also more scope to keep the process going in future. In particular, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act brought in provision for neighbourhood priority statements, which might make it easier in practice for parish councils to work with local authorities to get their priorities for an area registered and get these influencing the local plan process going forward. As with local plans, we'll also update our guidance on neighbourhood plans in the coming year. Next slide, please. So Roger's already covered the many points around land use strategy and land use framework. The only things I would add are that we're expecting the land use framework now to come out next year. It's unlikely now that it will come out this year, but there was a consultation on it at the beginning of the year, which many of you will be aware of. CPRE are strong supporters of the land use framework. We think it'll be really important to give context both to DEFRA's policies around food and the 25-year environment plan, but also government planning policy in the NPPF and in spatial development strategies, and also in particular energy policy around regional energy planning and the strategic spatial energy plan. So just before I move on to the next slide as well, just to pick up on Roger's points about green belts, we're particularly concerned about the NPPF changes that led to the introduction of a grey belt category within green belts. We're concerned at the moment there's a lot of the grey belt cases that are coming forward aren't in line with local plans, and that developers are able to get grey belt applications through on appeal. And we'll be saying more about this later in the year. Next slide, please. I won't say too much detail on this, but again, a big concern that we've had in many cases in recent years has been the lack of join-up between new housing developments and transport networks, and in particular that a lot of schemes have gone through even though local councils have registered significant concerns about poor road access, effects on road junctions, lack of links to good public transport. So that's an area that we want to see change. Next slide. And again, as previous speakers have also pointed out, that we have big concerns as well that most new housing that's being built, in particular in rural areas, doesn't meet any objective definition of affordable housing. Only about 17% of all new housing built in rural areas over the past decade it can be classed as affordable by the government's own definition. But even then, the current definition of affordable housing allows for schemes that are up to 80% of local market rents. And in many rural areas, that simply isn't affordable to people on average incomes or people in housing need. we think there are a number of changes that need to be made to planning policy to change this. So in particular, there should be an expectation of mixed tenure, a mix of tenures in all new housing developments. And this would actually benefit the government in terms of meeting its housing targets because the evidence clearly shows that when you build more mixed tenure developments, that they actually get built quicker. Whereas in recent years, the reason why build out has been so slow is because they've been generally tended to be larger 3 and 4 bedroom housing for a very narrow segment of the market. We're keen to support more community-led development, and our local groups have, in several cases, have supported development on rural exception sites on the edge of villages. And we know that parish councils have, in many cases, have led some excellent rural exception schemes, such as the one in Hinton Charterhouse in Somerset, which is pictured. But what we do need to see happen in future is if we're going to see more of these parish council-led schemes, is better coverage of housing needs assessment in rural areas, because several rural local authorities don't have up-to-date housing needs assessments. And if a parish council wants to bring forward a rural exception scheme, it has to actually do its own housing need assessment to justify why the affordable homes are needed. Rural exception schemes, just to pick up on a point in the chat, are schemes that are an exception from local plan policy. So most local plans have settlement boundary policies, and generally rural exception sites sit just outside the settlement boundary or on an edge of a village. So moving on to the next slide, please. Another big concern that we have is around the quality of design of new housing schemes. And we worked jointly with University College London in 2020, which found that the vast majority of large new housing schemes in England were either of mediocre or poor quality, and at least 20% of them should never have been given planning permission. And it's a particular issue in rural areas because the audit found that the further you get from London, the worse design quality gets. And the issues that the research found were very much those that Hugh highlighted in his talk at the beginning. So car dependency, a particular issue, but also lack of sensitivity to local character, and also poor environmental performance, and the abolition of the Code for Sustainable Homes was clearly linked to this in many cases. So what we want to see is we welcome the introduction of the Future Home Standard and the requirement to put solar panels on all new build schemes, but there's still a gap in terms of making sure that we have design codes and design guidance in all rural areas that can make sure that we get better quality design, and also better links to, as I pointed out, to rural public transport. Next slide, please. Another area where CPRE has done work which you might find valuable in terms of getting involved in local planning is around light and noise pollution. So we know that in many rural areas, dark skies are increasingly valued. So many national parks and national landscapes, for example, are seeking to become dark sky reserves. And our light pollution mapping can help make the case for stronger light pollution policies in your area. And our tranquility maps, which also map noise pollution and visual intrusion, as well as light more generally, as well as light pollution. They're also valuable in terms of judging whether a development is affecting a particularly tranquil area, or whether more can be done to mitigate noise or light effects in order for a scheme to be well designed and get planning permission. So again, there are some potentially good signs in terms of upward light pollution, but still a lot of concerns about the effect of downward light pollution on wildlife in particular, and there's still more that can be done on the design of lighting schemes to address that. Next slide, please. So if you care about all the issues that Roger and I have been discussing, and you want to join CPRE, we'd encourage you to join the the many hundreds of parish councils that are already members of CPRE and join us, because we provide a wide variety of services that are potentially useful to you, which are summarised on the slide. And many parish councils have good relationships with our local groups. As many of you will know, we're organised on a federal basis, and it's our local groups who are generally county-based who get involved in local plans and planning applications. And it's particularly valuable for them to work jointly with parish councils to understand key issues in rural areas. So we'd really love you to get more involved with CPRE, both locally and nationally, and there are more details on the slide about how you can do so. Many thanks, and that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger and Paul. Now I'd like to hand over to Andrew. Over to you, Andrew.
You can see my slides okay?
Yes, we can now.
My name's Andrew Tarleton, National Plan Advisory Society Local Council Clerks. I'm not going to, I think it's really good timing this, because there is a lot of issues coming to the fore in the planning system, and I think the MPPM reforms, which are coming later, and the other reforms could bring some of the issues to the fore. I'm not planning to go into the detail of planning reforms. There's better people have explained that. But to be fair to the government, I mean, there have been a number of previous governments who said they were going to really take to task the planning system, and it didn't happen. What we can say about this new government is they are serious about their intent in dealing with addressing some of the perceived failings of the planning system, and I emphasise the perceived failings. And so the reforms we're talking about are wide-ranging and fast-moving. There's a lot happening, large and small, and I'll touch on that as we go along. Obviously, planning is a discretionary function, so we don't really have to do this if you don't wish to do so. But clearly, the reforms are of some interest to us as a sector, and for many, planning is a key aspect of the activity for their town or parish council or any local council. The reforms themselves haven't really directly impacted greatly on parish councils. There have been, but I say that there have been some sort of things which have been directly impacted on the role of town and parish councils, and generally the government's reform agenda in terms of the role of planning parish councils is generally quiet, or when it has been, is generally beneficial. Obviously, there have been some bad news, the cuts in funding for neighbourhood planning, but not all bad. There is clearly a bigger role for local councils in the local plan appeal process and generally appeal process and their preparation. There's continued commitment to neighbourhood planning, including development of new types of neighbourhood planning, question mark, I know. Pre-applications discussions, still emphasising the need for town and parish councils and developers to work more closely at the pre-application stage. Community benefits, financial benefits for communities who face development pressures, seeing more of that, particularly around the renewal land use. And parish councillors and developers and more. Somebody's already touched on the role of parish councils potentially around affordable housing. We've seen tweaks around the, proposed tweaks around the compulsory purchase order powers to make it easier for parish councils to compulsory purchase land. So there is some developments, but the overall message is mixed uncertainty. Many of the inquiries, I dealt with one yesterday about barn conversions, does it need permission or not? The answer to that is I don't know, and neither did the local authority, to be blunt. And we're seeing a lot of where the planning system was traditionally difficult to navigate for the planning to navigate. It's got even more difficult to navigate. And that's cascading down to local authorities who sometimes, I'll be honest, don't know the answer, and they're making decisions in their right and based around a degree of uncertainty. So I've flagged up what some of the key concerns about the sector, what I've seen in terms of the case for my things is, we're not focusing on proper planning. Most of the effort now is focusing on housing numbers and delivery. A year ago, it was always about housing numbers, but increasingly other issues are coming to the fore, particularly around renewable energy schemes. But it's not about proper planning of an area. Often it feels like, let's get the numbers right and let's follow the proper planning later. Yes, there has been erosion of democracy and community engagement, and a number of speakers have mentioned this already. the government, I mean, I don't really understand why the government have got an issue with planning committees, but they clearly do when they want to have they want planning officers to make more decisions. It's not only that, it's about reducing time which we've been given to comment on planning applications. I mean, I was really welcomed, I'm talking personally, the House of Lords voted a government amendment to the Housing Planning and Housing Bill, which meant that effectively would give the government the power to quash, to stop, in certain circumstances, local authorities refusing planning applications. Pleased the House of Lords did that, but there is a message there. But what, more about housing, and when I'll touch on this, but yes, more housing and infrastructure, but what expense? It should be about the proper planning of the area and what's right for the needs of the community. Often it feels top down, not bottom up. Not a level playing field. We're encouraging, the government encouraging town and parish councils to get much involved in the local plan preparation. You've been a key stakeholder in when your local authority produces a local plan, or you get involved in other aspects of planning. But it's not a level playing field. We don't have the resources many often, and it's not equal. The resources available to developers far away, in most cases, what's available to town and parish councils. I'm not only talking about financial, I'm also talking about staffing. It's simply not a level playing field. And it's getting more difficult. It's even as a planning professional, it's getting more and more difficult to navigate around the planning system. I dealt with an inquiry yesterday where a parish council legitimately had done something thinking it was permitted development, and it wasn't. But that's because the rules have changed. And not only is it now, but not only does it mean now that they need planning permission for it, it's now subject to a thing called BNG. And so it's very difficult. Giving the parish councils greater powers to use compulsory purchase orders is fine, great, welcome. But how many town or parish councils have the resources to actually start compulsory purchasing ordering land or buildings? But, the government, what they're doing, they're introducing new types of planning approval, fast tracks of planning application for approval, national strategic infrastructure projects, which are national schemes, and which the government will deal with those planning applications more quickly. Yes, the new guidance does talk about the key role of town and parish councils in that process, and that's welcome, but it's another layer of bureaucracy and another different way for you to engage. It's hard to get your head around planning applications without looking at different types of planning applications. For example, prior approval or other types of planning approval. And councils are supposed to navigate around this while it's getting more and more complex. And it's not joined up. The government have focused the resources on their efforts on the reforms in particular parts of the planning system, rightly or wrongly. But they haven't done other bits, which in some parts of the country would say, well, are equally more important to reformed or bolstered. Enforcement. In many parts of the country, I know from doing things, enforcement is a major concern. But this seems to be largely ignored by the planning reforms. And it doesn't really talk about the need for bolstering enforcement. It's all about, often it feels it's simply about housing numbers. And so we have got challenges ahead as a sector. And the government uses phrases like somebody mentioned earlier, like working with the builders, they throw these phrases out, and I don't quite know what they mean. And I think the fear is that some generally view parish councils in the blockers as opposed to the builders. And that would be a shame and a missed opportunity. We know what is best for our community. 93% of neighbourhood plans produced in town or parish councils. And so actually, I think, we've been at the forefront of some of the key planning reforms, and the government needs us to deliver many of their changes. But it sometimes doesn't feel like that. And the risk for the government, and we saw it in the past, we've seen other examples, particularly around wind turbines, is that negative perceptions of the planning system by local will undermine the public trust in the planning decisions. People will lack confidence in the planning system. And what that could mean is, particularly for us, is people might say, well, I ain't going to engage. And I've had that from clerks recently. or we do move into the blockers territory. And parish councils increasingly are seen as being fighting development than actually trying to shape it. And that's a tricky one for us. But that's the risk. If people we're not carried away as part of the journey, the risk is we might try to get off. And there is this concept about, what is the planning system doing? So it's not about eroding democracy, and it's too top down. It's about development happening to you, not you shaping it. It's about concerns about what we're looking at, and other speakers covered on this. What are these developments we're doing, particularly large and small, going to look like in 20 years from now? If everything we're doing is supposed to be contributing to sustainable development, and that's the overarching principle, there is some doubts about if that's what we're doing. Are we just really carrying on more of the same, particularly around the concept of increased car journeys? And that's not only large developments, that means development in rural areas where there's no public transport, and the planning system makes public transport, and the planning system pays lip service to the need for it to be genuinely sustainable development. So there are challenges ahead, and there's a lot we need to think about. However, the risk is there is a key role for town and parish councils in the planning system, and that hasn't really changed. And I don't really, there are issues about who's advising the government on some of these planning reforms and the extent to which town and parish councils are part of that journey. But the point I'm making here, really, you've seen the other slide, is you've got to bear in mind that only a third of the country is parished. 2/3 of the country is unparished. And I still think, and I know we do a lot of work with developers and other ones who would agree with this, and sometimes they do view you as basically a cost on their bottom line, is I do actually think you're in a better position to try and influence the planning system, large and small, if you're in a parished area, than not. Now, it's discretionary. You don't have to do any of this if you don't wish to do so. But obviously, even though things may look dark for some of you and some of the uncertainty, I still think we should continue the good fight. And I generally think that if you live in a parished area, you're in a better position to influence development. As I mentioned earlier, the armoury is still there, or there's some doubts about some aspects. It's about, have you got the will or the capacity to take them up? And so the overall message is, I would say here is, yes, there are still some big battles to come about certain aspects of the planning system, particularly around housing numbers and maybe design. But we still need to try, and we're now, and if the government aren't listening to us, who are they listening to? So I do urge you to continue and try and shape and navigate you through an increasingly complex planning system and represent the communities which you serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I will now take questions from the Q&A box and put them to our panel of speakers. So I will start with, should a local authority have a clear statement on grey belt use in their own housing needs assessment? Who wants to take that question?
Thanks, Jessica. I can say a couple of things initially. Green belt's a strategic policy, and also as well, where it's worked effectively is where it's been seen as permanent and the changes made to it have only been exceptional. That should be how the policy is established. If grey belt's going to be designated by a local authority, it should only be done very exceptionally, and it should be done through the local plan process. So there's been an established process of doing green belt reviews in many local authorities already. And from what we're seeing, some local authorities are gradually bringing forward proposals for grey belt sites, first through green belt reviews and then through changes of designation through local plan policies. The problem that we've had over the past year is that a lot of developers have jumped the gun on this, and they're actually managing to get grey belt designated on the hoof through a planning appeal, and then get the scheme through on appeal. From our perspective, it should always be a plan-led process. Thanks.
Thank you. Now I will ask you a question. In Ascot, we have coverage with a BLP, an NP, and Ascot SPD. All of these have been swept aside by RBWM offices in favour of tilted balance. What can we do? Who wants to take that question?
I'll go back to just continue the fight, the good fight. The problem is, yeah, the balance has been, without getting to the 5-year land supply, there is a view that the too much weight has been attached to housing need, and then in some cases that is overriding many other important considerations.
Thank you, Andrew. Hugh, did you want to come in there?
Only to say that you have to be careful with this. This is partly the tilted balance is partly the legal profession's domination of planning. And it's about making important cases. When you don't have 5-year land supply, you're in a very difficult position as an authority to resist poor quality development, but it's not impossible to resist. And some of the best arguments I've seen run on things like flood risks, for example, are powerful arguments and are exceptions to the presumption in favour of development. So it really is important to go on making those arguments, and also to understand that while some parts of a local plan may be rendered out of date on 5-year land supply, not all of it, and all the rest of the policies still do apply. So arguments about quality, affordable housing and design do not get and should not get swept aside. So you might not be able to argue the principle, but you should damn well be arguing about the quality, and that's really worthwhile. I think there's a sense that people, we risk surrendering too much on some of these arguments.
Thank you. Now, my next question is, I'm interested in your comments about the neighbourhood plan. Our local district council has advised the process is likely to cost in the region of £20,000. Our annual budget is £8,000, and our clerk only works 4.5 hours per week. How do you suggest we approach this? Who would like to come in there? Hugh?
Yeah, I'm going to be cheeky. Yes, I've seen these figures. And in fact, actually, I saw a town council in North of England quoted £110,000 for the preparation of a neighbourhood plan. And what I suppose I'm suggesting is the have a go principle. Some elements of neighbourhood plan prep, are costs that have to be borne. Particularly if it needs to go to referendum and the district council's got to or planning authority's got to face that. But quite a lot of the costs are actually drawn up, I think, in employing consultants to help frame neighbourhood plan policy. I actually do not believe neighbourhood planning is that complicated or has to be that complicated. And I think you can get a long way with quite simple neighbourhood plan templates. And I think there's a reasonable amount of advice out there. I also think that, town and parish councils, again, like you, Roger, having been one, have a pretty clear sense of what they want to achieve. So the golden rule about that would be to break down those costs and see whether or not you can at least discount the need to employ people like me, essentially, and push on as far as you can with the advice that you can reach. The alternative is just to not do it. And I think in these current times, that would be a grave mistake.
Just making Hugh's point, it doesn't have to be that expensive. You're right, it's about focusing on the key activities. And the government are looking at doing neighbourhood plan light, but we don't no real feel what that might look like. And yeah, the role there is for neighbourhood planning. So yeah, I would just echo Hugh's point, really. You do see some scary figures quoted about the cost of producing neighbourhood plans, and they are maybe justified, but they don't have to be that expensive. Yes.
Thank you, Andrew. Now I have another question about neighbourhood plans. Is it still worth doing a neighbourhood plan if the district has already completed their local plan? Who would like to take that? Andrew?
Well, assuming if it's not in conform, if it's not, if it's in conformity to the local plan, yes. I mean, the only real conformity issues, from my experience, tend to work around housing numbers. Beyond that, yes. The short answer to that would be yes.
Thank you, Andrew. Hugh, did you want to? Sorry.
Sorry, I mean, just to add to Andrew's point, which I'd agree with, it definitely is worth. In some ways, it does make it easier for a parish council to do a neighbourhood plan if the local plan's already out, because they know what they have to deal with that in terms of context. And also, as we've shown in the research we've done, that neighbourhood plans have been hugely valuable in terms of designating areas of local green space. where the vast majority of local green space designations are in local plans, and there's usually a gap there that a neighbourhood plan can usefully fill. But similarly also as well, there have been a lot of very valuable neighbourhood planning policies around affordable housing. For example, making sure that if new affordable housing schemes are built within a village or a town, that the mix of them reflects what's needed in the community.
Thank you, Paul. Now, our next question says, we have never been consulted on pre-planning advice given to applicants. The first time we see a planning application within our town is when it is a finished application on the district website. Is this normal?
Well, I'm going to take this. There's a flaw in the government, and we've taken this. I know NALCANS and we have taken this up. If you're talking about formal pre-application advice, there is no statutory requirement on the local planning authority to consult the town or parish council when they're undertaking that. So it's not normal. It's a rarity, but many local plan authorities do make the decision not to consult with town or parish councils when they're entering into formal pre-application advice. I think it's a shame and a missed opportunity.
Thank you, Andrew. Does anyone else want to come in there? Okay, I will move on to the next question. This situation is made even more challenging where a council does not have a new local plan coming before the existing one expires, and they can demonstrate a 5-year housing supply, as per Shropshire, where my parish is located. How do we deal with this, please, and the arguments around the tilted balance? Is anyone able to come in there?
Well, if you've got an out-of-date local plan that can't demonstrate 5-year land supply, there's probably some short words to suggest the position that you're in. It's extremely difficult, but it's not just about local plan policy. Whereas, as I said, particular parts of the local plan might be rendered out of date by lack of 5-year land supply, the rest of the local plan policy isn't, and neither is the content of national planning policy, or national planning guidance, or the National Design Code, which has the status of national planning policy. In other words, I think the smart money is on making sure when you make a response that you're able to look at all of that material and make a powerful case back. It puts you in a position of vulnerability, but there is an important but. The tilted balance was not designed to disapply all of the other important considerations in national policy that reflect things like sustainable transport. It has come to be used in that way, partly because the development community are very adept at exploiting it. But it doesn't mean to say you've got no arguments left. Obviously, it depends on the case, but there's plenty in the NPPF to get stuck into in terms of upholding good design principles, and particularly in terms of sustainable location now.
Yeah,
thank you.
I mean, just to reinforce what Hugh was saying, actually, the government actually changed when the government changed the NPPF towards the end of last year in December, they did actually make some additions to the wording of the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which actually said that when things like the tilted balance apply, then local authorities or decision makers can also look at whether it meets the wider policies in this framework around good design and transport and sustainability more widely. So arguably the considerations that Hugh's pointed out are actually stronger in the NPPF now than they were before December 2024. And a lot of people haven't picked that up, and it's something that parish councils should definitely look closely at if they get any of these applications.
Thank you, Paul. Now I will move on to our next question. Is there any case law which is helpful for rural areas fighting major new developments without transport infrastructure or striving to protect SSSIs from pollution? Does anyone want to come in there?
I feel like we ought to be able to answer this question, colleagues, but it's a tough one. But we'll have a go. There's an enormous amount of case law on protection of designated sites, which is mostly available actually if you look online. I think there's less clear case law about major developments and transport infrastructure. There's two things to look at, isn't there? There's the case law framework, and then there's appeal precedent. And appeal precedents, of course, are also just very useful to get stuck into. But the challenge with looking at precedent is that policy has changed a lot. So to emphasise Paul's point, I think on transport location, you've now got a stronger set of arguments around that than you've had for about 10 years in being able to resist something that's not well connected. But I think the challenge that comes out of Suffolk is that it can very often be the case that people think they need legal expertise or legal support, and that'll be lovely, of course. There's normally, if you've got a KC living in the village, that's kind of handy, but you can actually get quite a long way, I think, establishing these arguments just with local knowledge and what you can find online.
Thank you, Hugh. Paul, did you want to come in there at all?
No, I was trying to scramble around seeing if I could think of an exact precedent, but I can't. So yes, what it says.
That's okay. I will move on to our next question. Who has the justification for housing targets by area, and were local councils consulted on the methodology? Hugh, did you want to come in there?
Well, it just makes me smile a bit because they certainly weren't consulted on the methodology, because the methodology is what's technically known as nuts. It was imported into the planning system to bypass a concern with demographic need, although the demographic, which is evidential base for housing need. The ONS has just published those today, if everyone's interested about household formation, so which is a challenging figures. But the current housing forecasting system is fundamentally based on a 0.8% increase in existing housing stock. Right, that's a completely arbitrary figure. It's not based on local housing need assessment. It's not based on any demographic understanding, but it's extremely convenient if you're a volume house builder. So local authorities weren't consulted about it, but the way they cascade down is through the local plan process into figures which are, and regionally now, there'll be a new regional tier that those figures cascade to, into hard and fast targets which local government have to deliver. And if they don't deliver them, they either get an out-of-date local plan, fail the housing delivery test. The thing to bear in mind, of course, is that local authorities have no power to deliver any homes. And please also bear in mind that we always consent, on average in a decade, about 80 to 90,000 more units for housing in this country than the private sector builds. It is a complete myth that we do not consent enough housing. We consent on average 300,000 and we build on average 220,000. Discuss.
Thank you, Hugh. Does anyone else want to come in there?
I just echo Hugh's points. I mean, it's maybe we want to ask who advised the government on some of the housing, how they reached the housing targets might be an interesting dialogue for a different conversation, but they certainly certain organisations or bodies we suspect were strongly involved in advising government how to do it. In terms of the consultation, I'm not drifting to politicians. I understand it was in the manifesto. I don't think it was. My humble opinion, you're right. It is what it is. If you're as a town or parish council thinking you're going to take on the housing numbers argument, I would advise you not to go down that route.
Thank you, Andrew. Now, another question. Is this going to lead to a major sidelining or nullification of town council and parish planning committees? Who would like to start there? Andrew?
I can start. My understanding is that the proposals have no impact on town or parish councils. They do not extend to town or parish council planning committees.
Thank you, Andrew.
That includes the requirement, which I suppose we've both raised now, that members of parish councils need to undertake, members of parish council planning committees undertake a requirement to undertake some form of planning training.
Thank you, Andrew. Paul? They shouldn't affect the status of parish council objections in principle, but assuming that the government does bring in what's effectively a triage system for planning committees, it's probably going to be as important as ever to work with your relevant district councillors and also work effectively with the officers of local authorities as well as where you can with the people who are on planning committees.
Thank you, Paul. Now, our next question. Should a parish council's response to a draft local plan just be to object to things like housing numbers? Or should we also be supportive of proposals to improve the economy and the environment, which would benefit our precept payers? Andrew, did you want to come in there? I think you might have answered.
Yeah, no, I would. No, I mean, this is difficult because it comes to resourcing. There is a sense in the government. They want parish council moved from focusing on commenting on planning applications to influencing local plans. I've just represented my own parish council hearing, and yes, do the support, because don't take anything for granted when it gets to the hearing. You know, things which you think are quite supportive. I'm being careful I'm saying. I've just been through a hearing where I thought the local authority had produced a very good plan around policy around climate change, and it had a hard time with the developers. So yes, because you can't assume because what it says in the draft plan will end up as the final document. I know it's a lot of resourcing, but I would encourage you to really get involved in the local plan preparation process.
Thank you, Andrew. Does anyone else want to come in here?
I just say a word to support that. That's where the smart money is. You can always tell where the most influential point in planning is, because it's where all the land promoters are, and so the local plan is a critical thing. And look, you know, the difficulty is because the government has created a planning framework which is reinforcing a lack of public trust, and it's not pursuing some of the objectives that we would like to see. There's a sense that we get defensive. But as I said when I kind of opened, the local plan is an opportunity. Parish council and town councils have got, particularly in the north of England, huge positive development proposals they probably didn't know they do want to see. The housing crisis is real. It's how we meet that crisis. So, you know, the planning process is meant to be positive, I think, and so it's important not to be too reactive, isn't it? But for example, if it was me at parish level, I'd be saying, yeah, like the West Oxfordshire case, we'll take this housing, but the housing has got to be flood resilient and genuinely zero carbon. Right, it's got to have a level of affordability to it, and that's the sort of policies which need to be advocated, particularly in the context, for example, of the government disastrously cutting London's affordability target last week because of pressure from developers. So parishes have got a huge positive role in local plans, and that is definitely where the smart money is.
Thank you, Hugh. Now I will move on to our next question. How can an NDP be revised alongside a draft local plan? A neighbouring parish had their new plan dates rolled back to the current LPA/LP final date. Who would like to come in there? That's how can a neighbourhood development plan be revised alongside a draft local plan?
Well, I'm happy to say it can. It's more difficult. But you know, it is more difficult. But I wouldn't prevent you from doing your neighbourhood plan, because obviously you can use the neighbourhood plan to influence the local plan. I'm trying to change it. Yes, you can. It is a bit more difficult because you're trying to guess what's in the numbers, particularly when you're dealing with the housing numbers. But if you're not dealing with housing allocations, it's more straightforward. But I wouldn't see that as a blockage to doing it. In some ways, you could argue because you're setting out your stall earlier.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Does anyone else want to come in there? Okay, I will move on to the next question. Where do you find the National Design Code? Is anyone able to explain where to find that?
Yeah, so that's online on the departmental website. You can search for it there on .gov. And as I said, it has a sort of similar status. 3 documents have the same legal status: the National Planning Policy Framework, National Planning Guidance, and National Design Code Guidance. So they're all, there we are. Thanks, Paul. They're all available there. And the important thing about them is that they do carry significant weight in the planning process. So they're worth getting to know. And I think one of those defining things about being influential over planning is that if you can learn the contents of the NPPF, you won't have any friends anymore, but you will be influential in the planning process. So it's worth getting to know those documents.
Thank you. Now, can you talk about the ideal balance between the community and the parish council leading on the development of a neighbourhood plan? Who would like to come in there?
Well, I feel the need. I'll try and fill the silence. I mean, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because if the heart of that question is how do you have a genuine piece of co-creation between parish and town and community, that's largely about having the resources to have that conversation at community level. I've seen it done well, but that tends to be in smaller parishes that are quite rural and quite cohesive. And I've also seen it done in more difficult areas, bigger towns where they've had big debates about what the future should be. But I think it really gets to the heart of what local democracy is about. Most of the post-bag of politicians is about planning, because planning actually impacts people's lives so much. So it's about how you can have that dialogue. I would strongly suggest, though, that it is about, I know you're going to laugh, but you need time, you need a bit of money, and you need a lot of cake. You need a really honest conversation with people, invite people in, create the opportunities for proper dialogue. Perfectly possible to do, I think, but you've got to take that responsibility seriously if you're going to do a neighbourhood plan, in order to get something that's genuinely about local community aspiration. Also think the challenge with it is that many of the issues we're facing locally are quite technical, so the parish and towns have got to be able to have some knowledge and talk about that. In my experience, they know that stuff, and I'm particularly thinking of flood risk and the way that's transforming individual places and what's acceptable in development in terms of what isn't. That's a debate that people will want to have with you, in my experience.
Thank you, Hugh. Does anyone else want to come in there? Okay, in that case, I will wrap up now with one final question for you all. So could I ask you all to sum up by providing one thing local councils can do straight away to start navigating the new planning framework, starting with yourself, Hugh?
Read the MPPF. Do not be discouraged, and always remember that you're at the heart of what is best for your own local communities. That's 3 things. So I broke your rule.
Thank you, Hugh. And now, Paul.
I would probably start with the local plan. Just find out what stage local plans are, when the next one's going to be consulted on, and also as well from later next year the process is going to change as well. So worth being aware of that. There's quite a few things that flow on from it, but I think I would add to Hugh's point that the local plan is key, really.
Thank you, Paul. Roger?
Yeah, I mean, related. Sorry, the trials of 2 in the same room. I think it's related to having a neighbourhood plan, but I think more importantly having a shared vision for your place, and that's got some buy-in and investment, and that's been taken to time, that's proactive and has an aspiration about it. And I think that if we've got that, then that can be the basis for a kind of renewal of neighbourhood plans, and can be something that has a longer lifetime than these political processes we've been talking about today.
Thank you, Roger. And Andrew?
I'm going to echo what everyone else said, really. I think, try and keep on form of what's happening, particularly reforms to the MPPF and government's planning reforms, but that's difficult. But obviously, we'll try and help with them. Do keep a close eye on the local plan, because I suspect they'll get increasingly important as things go along. And just keep on the good fight, really. You know your area best. You know what's best for your community, and try and convey that to the best of your abilities in whatever that mean within the planning context.
Thank you, Andrew. Now, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our fantastic speakers, Hugh, Roger, Paul, and Andrew, for their valuable and insightful contributions today. Please do fill out the feedback form when it appears on your screen. Our post-event mailing will include the chat and any presentations you saw today. Now, I'd like to say a huge thank you again to our partners for today's online event: Clear Council's Insurance, CCLA, and Black Share Elimination,